Hello all, I hope you're doing well. I don't know about you, but I've been quite shocked by the rise of Nick Fuentes. I've been quite confused about what's going on. I don't mean that in a liberal hand-wringing way. I mean, I don't mind that he's platformed. I'm interested to hear what he's got to say. What I mean is, you have to remember, for the past 7, 8 years, whatever it is that Fuentes has been around, he really has been persona non grata. I mean, to say his name even was to almost be an incantation of, Hitler or the devil. And for years and years, he'd just basically been way beyond the fringes. And then all of a sudden, as if overnight, he's just featuring on all these very big podcasts, getting quite favourable interviews, and of course, amassing huge views. Something about it just has made me think this isn't organic. When I say that, I don't mean that there isn't a case for organic growth for someone like Fuentes. Of course there is. What I'm saying is normally that organic growth would be completely hacked down at the roots. That's what really leads me to be quite confused as to what's going on. It's easy to see why he's experiencing and enjoying this growth at the moment. The main one, obviously, is his criticisms of the Zionist cause. That's very much his USP and Zionist influence in the American government. And I think, perhaps in years gone by, a voice like Fuentes wouldn't really be as prominent. But I think we have to remember, in the era of Western nations essentially realising that they may become minorities in their own countries, people not just on the right, arguably you could say the centre, arguably you could even say the old left, the socialisty left in the 70s and 80s, hard day's work for hard day's pay, those sorts of people who, might have been economically left, trade unions, but were more socially conservative, they too are all concerned about the levels of migration. And I think in Britain, America, wherever else, especially America, it's hard to sell to people that you have to be heavily invested in an ethno-nationalist cause for another nation somewhere way, way, way far away from you. But if you don't even go that far, but just have concerns about your own country, you're an evil, racist, anti-Semite and so on, or a bigot or whatever else. And you can kind of see how that's led to the growth of someone like Fuentes. Throw on top of that the brutality of the war in Gaza. That also plays into his, his takes as well. So I think that's point number one. And the other thing I think to say with regards to the growth of Fuentes that we have to remember is the MAGA movement has, it's kind of suffering because it tried to be all things to all men on the centre and the right. And in many ways, it's falling apart because of that now. Number one, you could say it struggles to be America first, which is Fuentes' great claim. But this clip went viral on Twitter the other day, and it is unbelievable. I won't play it, I'll just play it on the screen now. But it's Jordan Peterson and Dave Rubin. And it's quite unbelievable. But they're talking about how gay guys raise kids. And it's bizarre, really. I mean, it's normal if you're a Guardian Easter, of course, and I don't know, you're on the Owen Jones podcast, but for a conservative movement, this isn't conservative. I mean, young men are not inspired by insights of how gay guys somehow commandeer children and then, feed them milk and things like that. This is left-wing stuff. And again, you can see why, especially young men, are thinking, well, this isn't what we signed up for with MAGA. And you might say, well, yeah, but these aren't strictly MAGA. Well, they're certainly MAGA adjacent. That's the thing. And again, it turns people towards Fuentes. And I think the big one as well that we have to factor in is many people post-Charlie Kirk have drifted towards Fuentes. Now, you could view that as just an organic thing, or maybe that's something that's been manipulated, manufactured. The point is that it's happened. And I think that was because, number one, of the shocking death of Charlie Kirk, which was so appalling and horrifying. But secondly, just how many on the left just basically laughed, pointed and laughed, the most appalling displays of inhumanity. And with that as well, even the sort of, more sensible leftists, quote unquote, or the centre leftist types, even they were like, well, these images are shocking, but look, Kirk said some controversial things, blah, blah, blah. And you kind of thought, well, hang on a minute, that's not the point, And again, I think it's radicalised a few people to start to basically think, well, look, if they're going to act like this, we need to go to our big guns and basically turn to someone like Fuentes. Now, with all of this in mind, I don't think it's too hyperbolic to say that Fuentes you could argue is probably the third most influential voice on the American right now. Of course, behind J.D. Vance and most prominently Donald Trump. But Donald Trump is old. And Vance, of course, is tarnished with MAGA. So it remains to be seen in the post-MAGA world who will really come out on top. And there is an argument that Fuentes could be the spiritual leader of the right in America. But what's most interesting here is how you'd think, if everything Fuentes has said about the system, and many who would agree with him, is true, that he would be squished down, again, relegated to the fringes, basically just cancelled on everything. There was a time, remember, where he wasn't just cancelled on social media. There was a time where Nick Fuentes couldn't even fly. He was on the no-fly list in America. It was that bad. I don't know even now if he's allowed to bank. I think he has to do everything in crypto because he's not allowed a bank account, which, shows you how cancelled he's been. But then, as I say, it just got my scratching my head, when he just started to feature on all these podcasts, these mainstream podcasts with sort of, MAGA sympathetic types. I've said it before, Patrick Bet-David, Russell Brand, and perhaps most prominently, famously now, Tucker Carlson, who is a massive figure in American politics, or the American right. And it was interesting because these people weren't just platforming him, they were really giving him friendly softball interviews. And I thought that's quite suspicious from the top because, I was expecting a bit more edge, criticism. You said this. There's plenty of crazy things Fuentes has said. But there was none of that really. It was kind of tell us your story and let's hear all about you. Now, to be honest, I watched all of this go on and was just thinking, but I can't think of any angle as to why this would happen. And thought, I'm probably just overthinking it. It could, and it still could, just be all completely organic. Maybe I'm just wacky in these theories I'm saying. Could well be the case. But then with the election of Mamdani in New York, and especially the response from lots of the liberal media, I started to think, okay, I think there could be a theory here, and it's worth just airing. As I say, this is just a theory. I'm not saying this is exactly the case. But what I mean is, I think there could be a play here, not to actually see Fuentes and America First conquer, but a long-term play to actively destroy it. And not only destroy Fuentes and the America First movement, but more broader nationalism, nativism, and even anti-globalist sentiment for a generation, not just in America, but across the whole Western world. After all, for many of us in the Western world right now, we're pretty much approaching the last generation that can really do anything about the massive globalist takeover and the demographic change that's happening across really the whole of the West. Now, a quick disclaimer before I begin. Obviously, I'm on very controversial ground here, so a word to the Stasi. This is purely a work of political hypotheticals. I'm not creating this video to agree or disagree with Nick Fuentes' positions or past statements. It's purely a work of neutral political analysis. So with that in mind, it'll probably keep me out of the gulag for another day. One can live in hope. But as I say, my biggest suspicion with all this stuff came in Nick's interview with Tucker Carlson. Now, again, it was very softball, which I thought was suspicious anyway, because these two have been at loggerheads. I would have thought, have a little bit of friction, but it was just very friendly, very simple. And one of the things I thought was a big giveaway was when Fuentes spoke about his dinner with Donald Trump. Now, this was big news when it happened, but I've heard this story before. And the way Nick has told it before, and I think probably told it on this podcast, was essentially Kanye West and Donald Trump were supposed to have dinner. Kanye West was massive at the time and probably hadn't quite gone as far as he has now. And West, in typical Kanye fashion, took along Nick Fuentes, I think secretly. So they just went and met Trump. Trump didn't know who Fuentes was. Now, apparently, as Fuentes tells the story, they're all getting on great, having a good laugh and talking about politics and the like. And then halfway through the meal, Trump gets up, takes a phone call, and comes back and is apparently really irate, effing and blinding at them. You set me up. He's obviously got a call saying, look, Fuentes is this far-right, white supremacist, Nazi nutcase, all of the cliches, and this is just going to play awfully for you in the media. So Trump basically loses his SHIT, and then they're kicked out. That's the whole story. Now, on Tucker Carlson's podcast, you see that bit's all cut. And it's kind of odd because if you have dinner with Donald Trump, well, that's obviously big news anyway, but if he goes absolutely nuts at you, that's the even bigger news, right? So that's the key of the story. So immediately I thought, well, they've obviously redacted that on Tucker's podcast. Well, why? It's clear that they obviously don't want to create a friction between Trump and Fuentes anymore. They want to almost have that smoothed over because it would seem that Fuentes is basically going to take the crown from Trump. But again, after I saw that originally, I thought, well, all right, there's a theory there, but it's not going anywhere, because even if Fuentes does become the leader of the American right post-MAGA, he's still way too controversial to secure mass support from the American public, and especially not the core power groups within MAGA, which obviously that's something Trump's done very well. He's brought in lots of disparate strands and created a big movement, if you will, that's very strong. And Fuentes just isn't going to be able to do that, obviously. I mean, the big one is the Zio, right? A lot of funding there, a lot of historic support. And they obviously aren't going to like Fuentes. He's public enemy number one and then some. And then, of course, you have the colorblind right. I'm thinking, the Indian guys, Vivek, what's he called, Ramaswamy, something like that, and this Dinesh D'Souza, people like that who kind of think, they're broadly MAGA adjacent, but they're going to hate Fuentes and his message of wanting America to remain a European majority country. Then you're going to have the sort of libertarian bros represented by people like Joe Rogan and all that stand-up comedy, troupe he has around him on his show. They're all right with MAGA, they're all right with Trump, but they won't be all right with Fuentes. It's going to be way beyond the pale for them. And then all the, aforementioned, what they called intellectual dark web people they call themselves. Jordan Peterson leads them. We've already seen, he's basically a liberal when you look at it, talking about gay parenting. They are going to hate someone like Nick Fuentes. And then, of course, you've got, the big Protestant voting bloc, the Bible Belt, who are going to see Fuentes as an enemy, number one, because he's devoutly Catholic, number two, because he's going to go against a lot of their Christian message, but also because of his criticisms of Israel. A lot of the Bible Belt tend to have that eschatology where they believe, the fulfillment of the state of Israel is vital for the second coming of Christ, so their support of Israel is on a religious level. So again, it basically felt like I hit a bit of a dead end with that one and thought, well, again, it's probably just organic growth. But as I say, then the Mamdani win happened in New York. And of course, he won on this progressive populist platform, supposedly. But in reality, we all know, look, he won because of demographics. It's just how it goes in big cities, same as London with Sadiq Khan. But what was interesting was the media line afterwards, especially the liberal media line. A lot of it was talking about how Mamdani got the right quote-unquote formula. This is obviously big S, like I said, it's just demographics. But the point is that this line of formula can be carried through into another election, a propaganda tool, if you will. The formula itself won't work, but you can basically construct a media manipulation to make people think it will. Now, I'm not saying that they're going to basically put someone like Mamdani against Fuentes. He's too radical. He won't win over Heartland America. I'm saying they're going to lead with this idea of the right formula. What I'm talking to is essentially a progressive, more quote-unquote centrist movement, having the ability to bring in large swathes of the left, the centre, and even what was once the MAGA sympathetic right. So the point is here, if Fuentes, and by extension America First, can be promoted to lead the right, even perhaps the GOP, it would seem on the surface like a disaster for globalist interests. But is it really, when you break it down? I mean, as I've already said, Fuentes is a hardcore Catholic. He's a hardcore nationalist. He speaks about things like European identity. And again, this is growing in opposition at the moment on the right. No doubt about that. Across the Western world, as people are concerned about the demographic takeover of their countries. But the big question is, can it lead on a national scale in a country like America, which is already massively divided, already 57% white, I think it is, with a lot of those whites, liberals who vote for the Democrats anyway. So the big question is, can it lead, especially, and this is the key point, with a highly controversial, a highly disagreeable, and a highly divisive figure such as Nick Fuentes? And this is where you can probably see my theory coming to light. If the right can be funneled in, or what's left of it, into Fuentes, it will seem like a win to many people. However, that might not scale across the whole of a critical mass of an American vote. What you essentially have is more of a niche, quote-unquote, extreme voice that most people aren't going to vote for. If you then put that Fuentes up against someone like, say, Gavin Newsom, governor of California, handsome, mature, more welcoming, calmer, more of a centrist figure, it's easy to see how that figure could actually win the next election. As I say, Fuentes seems like he's growing exponentially, but that's because he's in opposition. When you're in a leadership position, it's very different. You have to keep different groups happy. That's very, very difficult when you're running up to an election. And what I'm saying here is it could be very easy for the aforementioned key groups to turn on Fuentes. He looks like he's destroying them all at the moment. But the point is, when he's in power, they will all turn on him in one united front. And this could be very useful for some of those dimensions. For starters, when we think about Zionist power, the big thing that Fuentes goes for, you can see at the moment that those interested in the Zionist cause must be very concerned. Historically, they had support on the left as just another minority group. That's really gone with the Muslims. The Muslims tend to win on the left now. They are the sort of cherished ones. And henceforth, because of that, Zionists are very much the enemy. So they're not so welcome on the left. On the right, of course, they've lost a lot of favour for the aforementioned issues as well. So they don't really have anywhere to go. But if you can make a figure like Fuentes, a quote-unquote Nazi, the reincarnation of Hitler, the most prominent person on the right, the biggest problem in the country, what does that do? It creates a common enemy between the Muslim, between the Jew, between anybody else, the black folks, everyone. And you can all point to Fuentes and say, look, we may have our disagreements, things may have gone wrong in the past, but that's the real enemy. He's going to kill us all. And we either stand together against this guy, or we're all going to basically be destroyed. We have to remember, at the moment, you could argue that the Zionist cause is becoming increasingly public enemy number one in America, but with a play like that, you can flip the script, make Fuentes public enemy number one on the national scale, and therefore the Zionist project can continue unabated. It's just switched sides subtly. Now, this theory would play in as to why Ben Shapiro's response to Nick Fuentes was basically so soft. I mean, many people pointed out that all he did is just played clips of Fuentes and said, look, here he is, he's a racist, he's evil. But this was classically leftist liberal. I mean, this is what they've done to Shapiro over the years, and that's not really going to affect someone like Fuentes because, he's been told this all his life, as of all his followers. They don't really care about being called a racist and so on anymore. But the point is, could it actually be more of a positioning from someone like Shapiro to be preparing the ground to take a new stance in a year or two as Fuentes grows, i.e. saying, look, I've always opposed this Nazi, etc. You could also see a lot of the MAGA adjacent types I mentioned before following the same track. People like Vivek and Dinesh D'Souza. Well, I'm a conservative, these are my beliefs, but this guy's completely beyond the pale, he's completely nuts, we all need to stand against him. You can see Joe Rogan saying the same thing on his podcasts. You can see Jordan Peterson, I think he's unwell at the moment, but presuming he gets better, he'll do one of his scowling videos and take along a few million of his followers. You narcissistic psychopath Nazi scum, one of those sorts of things. Who cancels who? All of that, drama. You can also picture Peterson doing one of his, teary, crying monologues. I've studied extremism and we've got to fight it. We've got to fight it. That sort of thing, and he'll probably take a large swathe of libertarians with him over to the centre as well. My point is that this could lead to a large swathe of MAGA and the large vote that comes with it, basically saying, look, we're not hard right, we were always libertarians at heart, so we don't agree with any of this, and obviously they'd have a big media machine behind them. Remember, they might be returning to a more accepting environment on the centre and the centre-left as well, because, the woke thing has died down or gone to the fringes a little bit, so it's a lot easier for them to return away from the quote right. Now, if this does come to pass, it would seem that the theory would be that the powers that be are going to suck all support away from the right, in essence to leave Fuentes and the Groypers and the America First movement solitary and exposed. And in many senses, this is where Nick's personality will really be under the spotlight. And he's a very strong personality, so I think he'll be able to stand alone. He always has. But there are problems with people like that. First of all, where Nick is sort of brilliant in his oratory at times, he's very outspoken and sometimes can go too far too quickly. That's funny when it's online, but it's not going to work so well when basically you're the head of a movement. He's also very strong. You can see that. He's not deterred by being cancelled by absolutely everybody. He just keeps coming back. but he's also very disagreeable, which means, internal fractures within his own movement, when you're already exposed, get magnified times 100 and so on. Again, he's very funny, but with that, he can easily be OTT. He says stupid things every now and again that just aren't really going to play well, even with his own base at times. He can split people apart and just want to be correct in a minority of one. Again, fine when you're some edgelord online, not so good when you're leading a mass movement. Now, at this point, when he does say something stupid, we have to remember already there are just legions of social media reels, I think they call them, little clips of him saying the most outrageous things. And a lot of them, they're easy to take out of context. Some of them are in context. But my point is that these are easy to just fly out there from the machine constantly. And before you can even say, actually, that's out of context, the next one's already there. So it's very, very easy to basically stitch someone like Fuentes up quite quickly. In essence, the point of this video is that yes, Fuentes is growing and growing massively, but could it be that the powers that be have realised, look, we can't contain this guy anymore, he's gaining more and more support on the underground, and they've decided to think, look, the best way to do this is to basically expose him, because then he lacks, if you like, this underground support that he gains every time we sort of cancel him or don't let him have a voice. It makes him look right. So we need to bring him out, completely out, put him as the leader of a movement. You get, if you like, the sort of MAGA adjacent, or what was once MAGA, to shift sides, or at least say, I'm not going to vote for that guy, and completely go for him. And with that, you've essentially not just destroyed Fuentes, who is the biggest thorn in your side, but with it, the America First movement. And most importantly, this is the most important bit, every bit of nationalist sentiment, even if it doesn't agree with some of the more extreme beliefs and comments and attitude to Fuentes, is going to be tarred by the same brush. Any anti-globalist sentiment automatically becomes extreme. It's aligned with the most crazy of the Fuentes reels, and it really drags everybody out and exposes them as well. Now, a counter-argument to this could be, well, so what? Let's just say Fuentes is put on the national level and then destroyed, you can just get another movement after. Well, not exactly. First of all, it's very difficult to gain the support and the momentum. But most importantly, American demographics are on a knife edge. You only need another election or two to have a critical mass of essentially the globalist liberal vote, and then again it will just dominate forever. There'll be no coming back from it. At that point, it's total globalist takeover, total globalist control. And like Mamdani, they'll say, oh, look, it's this wonderful formula we've created of progressive justice in America, but the truth is it's basically just demographics and a right wing that's been split and turned against each other. Now, another counter to that counter could also be that, as many people have pointed out recently, Fuentes' message has become a bit more civnat, if you will. So again, he might be trying to appeal across different groups because he's aware of this play that's going on. And again, he knows he might lose some of his base, but he might appeal more en masse and be able to push back. I'm not saying this is all certain. I'm just saying these are theories. And to my mind, something odd is going on why someone who's been so on the fringes is just exploding at the moment and being platformed by such prominent figures. And to be clear as well, I'm not saying that the people who have platformed Fuentes are somehow in on some great conspiracy. I would think it would be more like they've been given the green light by their lawyers or something and the social media platforms they're on, and henceforth they know that they can, just do this interview. That's all they probably know or care about. But the higher-ups are obviously green-lighting this somewhere. Another concern of mine with regards to people like Fuentes, he is funny, he is charismatic. At times he does go too far and probably doesn't speak carefully enough. And to someone like me who's much more interested in traditionalism over nationalism, I think there is an argument where you can find other traditions around the world to actually unify, to join forces against the globalist corruption of sacred order. I think that's a much stronger argument in the future. I know some people might say, well, that's a little bit idealistic. Maybe it is. But I think that's much more unifying in the long run than the other approaches of more nationalisms, which tend to be quite aggressive and I think are too ripe for basically coercion and manipulation. As I've said before, a lot of these sort of nationalisty types seem to be very pent up, very angry, very ready to go. But to my mind, it's just not going to work. It's like someone entering a boxing fight or a UFC fight, just, arms flailing, screaming, going mental. You're just going to get taken out. These things take poise and precision and the rest of it. Anyway, these are just my thoughts. As I say, all of this is just a theory, so don't think I'm saying this is the case. It just all seemed very odd to me, and I was just projecting where all of this could potentially go. As always, do let me know your thoughts down in the comments, and do consider subscribing to the channel if you're new.